world events are getting pretty scary, and the United Nations are taking a stand. Now, are they standing up against nations that terrorize their citizens? Are they standing up against countries with subpar human rights? No, they're taking a stand and making demands on us Canadians. Yes, you heard that right. Canada is on the United Nations bad list for racial discrimination against Indigenous peoples when it comes to oil and gas development. The UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or UNERD, is calling for the immediate and total scrap of 3 major infrastructure projects: the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and the Site C Dam. The UN wants Canada to give any and all concerned First Nations communities complete veto power over all major infrastructure projects, and they're concerned about, which I quote, forced removal, disproportionate use of force, harassment and intimidation, and escalating threat of violence against First Nations peoples. According to the RCMP, there are no instances of violent arrests or unnecessary use of force. Any arrests made were necessary, and these protesters were violent and threatening. UNERD also wants Canada to fully adopt UNDRIP, or the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, into law. Canada has adopted the UNDRIP, but it has not been made into law as of yet. Now, what that means is that we would have to establish a new legal and institutional frameworks that ensure adequate consultation that obtains full, prior, and informed consent on any and all development projects. This would mean a complete stop to any current projects and any future projects that don't meet the UN's level of consultation. Now, former Attorney General and highly respected MP Jody Wilson-Raybould warned Trudeau that working all of UNDRIP's demands into Canadian law is just unworkable. The thing I find completely frustrating is that the 18-person panel at the UNERD seem to completely ignore the level of engagement and consultation Canada places on projects like TMX, Coastal Link, and Site C Dam. So let's lay a little truth on them. Since the UN seems to find it acceptable to ignore the truth, I find it acceptable to present the facts. Yes, just the facts on the level of consultation on these projects. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project has been consulting with First Nations people since 2012, and they have over 30,000 points of contact with more than 133 communities. At least 48 mutual benefit agreements with First Nations groups have been signed. Now, this is a historic number for support for one single project in Canada. Trans Mountain also gave $13 million for these groups to conduct traditional land, marine, and ecological knowledge studies. The UN should also take note that First Nations groups like the Iron Coalition, Project Reconciliation, and the Western Indigenous Pipeline Group are all wanting to buy the project from the federal government. The Coastal GasLink pipeline project also started their consultation process back in 2012, and they have over 15,000 points of contact with various First Nations groups along the route. They've also awarded $620 million in work contracts for First Nations businesses. Chief Archie Patrick of the Stellit End First Nation has openly stated that the Coastal GasLink consultation process set the standard on how to deal with Indigenous peoples, but he also stated that UNDRIP weighs heavily on groups being able to say no and focuses very little on them to say yes. But now the Coastal GasLink has also had its fair share of pushback, with protesters blockading and obstructing it. It got to the point where the BC government had to issue an injunction against the protesters. In terms of the Site C Dam, they began their consultation process back in 2007 and sat down with 60 First Nations groups across 3 provinces. After those consultations, they made major adjustments to the project to alleviate and accommodate any concerns brought forth by them. The UNDRIP and the UNERD completely ignores the headway and the leadership of Canada when it comes to our consultation process. The UN also ignores all the First Nations communities and groups that support natural resource development and infrastructure projects. Now, these groups, they have a very serious stake in these projects. Alberta's Energy Minister Sonia Savage calls the United Nations criticism of Canada unfair and out of context. She also made it very clear that the UN is not the ones who get to decide how we Canadians and our economy are governed. That's for elected officials to do, not some self-appointed committee. Savage released a statement, and I quote, "With all the injustices in the world, it's beyond rich that the unelected, unaccountable United Nations would seemingly single out Canada, one of the greatest champions of human rights, democracy, and rule of law." So why is the UN singling us out? Why aren't they going after countries like China, Venezuela, or Iran? But more importantly, what will Trudeau do? He's been snuggling up to the UN since the beginning of his first term. Now, if he continues with these major infrastructure projects, he's in breach of a declaration he adopted, one he never should have adopted. As usual, Trudeau has no comment, and all the focus is pushed from the UN shaking its finger at us to Trudeau's beard. Why do we need a committee that has never been elected by the people dictating what Canada should and shouldn't be doing? A committee with members whose own countries have some of the worst human rights standards in the world. The answer is pretty simple. We don't. We don't need the UN telling us what to do, what laws we incorporate, what projects we build, and how we live. As Brett Wilson said, the UN is an internally stacked deck with delusional left-wing alarmists and accuses Canada of infrastructure racism. The UN can F off. And I completely agree.